Thanks for joining us. For more great content like this, visit polishingthepulpit.com or search for Polishing the Pulpit in your favorite podcast app. Also, be sure to check out PTP 365 for thousands of more videos just like this. You can learn more by visiting 365.polishingthepulpit.com, and to make it easy for you, we've put a link in this video's description. Let's sing a song and study together.
Good morning, ladies. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be able to speak to you this morning, and how much happier I would be if we were together and could give each other a good hug. How much we have missed hugs in the past few months. Let me just say that all of us as Christians, as faithful Christian women, know that there is someone whose arms we can run to any time, who will give us that feeling of safety and security. And ladies, I just ask that during these times, every one of us get on our knees, study God's Word, and run to Him in the safety and security of His arms. Several years ago, I was asked to speak on the topic, If the Shoe Fits. And I thought, what in the world? What can you get from the Scriptures about if the shoe fits? So I went home and I looked in my closet. It's a funny thing. Every shoe in my closet was either black or some form of beige. Apparently, I'm not trying to make a statement with my shoes. It was pretty boring, actually. And I thought, how can I tell a story about shoes? And then I remember a time when I was wearing a pair of shoes that were not me. Many years ago, after my father died, I went and stayed with my mom. And the next night, we were going to have the visitation. I had stayed with Mother. I didn't have clothes. I didn't have shoes. And for the visitation the next night, my mother said, "Oh, Sheila, I have a dress you can wear." I thought, okay, that'll be fine. I don't care about a dress. Just whatever you have, Mother, I'll wear it. Mother brought out a dress. Oh, it was a black dress. But it was a black dress with red flowers, huge red flowers, spotted on the black dress. And I thought, okay, I can wear this dress. Mother thinks it looks nice. I can wear it. So then she said, "Sheila, do you have any shoes?" And I said, "No, Mother, I don't have any shoes." She said, "Oh, I have the shoes for that dress." And guess what? She did have the shoes for that dress. The shoes that Mother brought for me to wear with that dress were bright red high heels. Yes, now imagine this. I'm going to my father's visitation and I have on a black red floral dress and red high heels. I felt about as out of place as I could possibly be. And yet, during the whole thing, I felt like, "Sheila, you're too focused on the shoes." Do sometimes we lose the focus in our lives? Does that happen to you? I've heard Kyle tell the story many times about Kevin Carter. And Kevin Carter was a young photojournalist, and his job at 32 years old in 1993 was to go to Sudan and to photo and take pictures, photojournal everything that was happening there during the famine. Now talk about a hard pair of shoes to be wearing. He had to take pictures of young people who were following the camels around to get their feces to eat. He was taking pictures of emaciated people. And daily he saw this sadness, but his goal there, his focus was to take the pictures. One day, nearing Kevin's last day there, he was in a small village, and he happened to come upon a bush, and there under the bush was a tiny body. He looked closely. He thought it was a little girl. The body was curled up in the fetal position, and within a few feet away, there was a vulture. Now, there was a food station several yards away, and maybe this little girl was trying to get to the food station. That's not what was in Kevin Carter's mind at the moment. Kevin Carter thought, if I could take a picture of this vulture with his arms spread open, about to pounce on that little girl, what a picture that would be. So Kevin Carter stood there for several minutes, and he watched the little body, and he watched the vulture. And the vulture never did spread its wings. But the people who were coming for Kevin Carter came in a plane, and he knew he had to get there quickly or he would miss the plane. So Kevin Carter took the snapshot of the child beneath the bush and the vulture waiting to pounce. He ran and got on his plane. He came back to the United States. For a young man, 32 years old, what a picture that was. In a few months, Kevin Carter won the Pulitzer Prize for that picture. It was called The Vulture and the Little Girl. You know, several days later, people started calling into his offices. And they said, not what a beautiful picture that was. Do you know what they said? They said, what happened to the little girl? And do you know the answer to that? Kevin Carter did not know what happened to the little girl because he was so focused on getting that picture and how his shoes could have changed if he'd have picked up that little girl and saved her life. But no, he was focused on taking that picture. Sometimes in our lives, we focus too much on the shoes instead of the Savior. You know, that happened to Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 18. It had not rained for 3 years. And this day, Elijah was going to call down rain from heaven. He was going to call down God to put the fire on the... No, I'm not getting this right. All right, I'm going back to sometimes we change shoes quickly. And then sometimes in our lives, we have to change shoes very, very quickly. Elijah, in 1 Kings chapter 18, on Mount Carmel, had been wearing the best shoes of his life. On that particular day, he called on God to bring fire from heaven to destroy the altar and the bull on the altar and to lick up all the water that was in the trenches. You see, the prophets of Baal had been trying to do that all day long. They had been calling on Baal. They had been calling on Baal to the extent that they were cutting themselves, bleeding profusely, to ask Baal to bring down that fire on the altar, and he could not do it. And then Elijah said, my God. He called on the name of my God, who is the God. And God sent down the fire and it licked up the water. And everybody at that time said, Elijah, your God is God. And now sometimes I think I need to tell the rest of the story, because I think when we teach our children sometimes we don't tell the whole rest of the story. You see, on that day, Elijah had the 450 prophets of Baal executed. Yes, he had them executed. Do we often in our Bible stories to the children tell the whole story? Do we tell that David actually beheaded Goliath? I mean, maybe we don't get to that point sometimes. Maybe we tell a little bit of the story, the soft part of the story that feels good. I mean, truthfully, was Joseph's life about a coat? You know, we spend hours in our Bible class and we color the coat so perfectly, and we put the many colors just right, and the coats are beautiful. But we've spent 30 minutes of our class time teaching the children about a beautiful coat. That's not Joseph's story. Joseph's story is that he had to wear some really ugly shoes sometimes. He had to be accused of things he didn't do. He had to spend 17 years in prison for things he didn't do. We don't even know if God talked to him during that time. Joseph had a hard pair of shoes to wear, and yet he remained faithful to God through it all. And when Potiphar's wife was testing him, he didn't say, how can I sin against Potiphar? He said, how can I sin against God? You see, ladies, the story of Joseph is faithfulness through all kinds of times. When we're talking about the lost sheep, really is the story about the lost sheep. Because the truth of the matter is, we spend 30 minutes of class time putting the little cotton on the sheep. And we forgot to tell the children that these are souls. And we're supposed to be going and saving and finding souls. The story is not about the sheep. And what about Sampson? Was Sampson really the strongest man in the Bible? Think about it. Physically, Sampson was a strong person, no question about that. Spiritually, was Sampson a strong person? I think that most of us would have to say not most of the time. His parents would tell him, don't marry those women, and he would marry those women. Don't go with those women, they are not good for you spiritually, and he would do it. You see, spiritually, Samson was weak. And that's why he ended up with his eyes out. That's why he ended up crushing the wine presses, because he was weak spiritually. That's the real Samson story. And we need to tell our children those stories, because when the time comes, when they're faced with the hardest things in life, they need to know that the sheep is not the cotton, that Joseph is not the coat, and that Samson was weak many times spiritually. Let's tell the truth of the Bible stories to our children. One time a lady came up to me and said, Sheila, from a chapter you wrote in one of the books, I think maybe you don't believe in using puppets to teach children. Do you think you should use puppets? I said, of course you can use puppets. My argument is, if you spend 35 minutes on telling a story about a puppet, and you don't use Bible names and Bible examples, and the children don't know the Bible names and the Bible characters, and they come away knowing the names of the puppets instead of the truth of the Bible story. You know, it's like one time my husband was teaching a group of children on the front row of the congregation, and he said, who was the giant? And one of the children raised their hand and said, the cucumber. The cucumber was the giant. Because in Veggie Tales, the cucumber was the giant. But did they know about Goliath? And did they know that David cut off Goliath's head? Did they know that David won not because he was strong physically, but because he was strong and believed that God was right there with him? These are the stories that will help our children get through the hardest times in life. But let's go back to what happened to Elijah. Here's Elijah, greatest moment of his life. Shoes fit beautifully. He loved being the one who could ask God to call fire down from heaven. But guess what happened the next day? The next day, Elijah had to put on his running shoes. His running shoes, because he was sent a message that Jezebel said, you will be as dead as those prophets by tomorrow. Wow. All of a sudden, the king of the mountain has become the prey. And he's got to put on a pair of running shoes, he thinks. He puts on his running shoes and he starts running. He runs from Jezebel. He tells his servant to go away because he wants to just die. He gets to a state of terrible depression and discouragement. He says, Father, just let me die. And he's told to lay down and rest. Elijah, rest. And Elijah rested under a tree. And when he woke up, there was food there. You know, ladies, that's a lesson for us. When we get down and discouraged, and we think maybe, as Elijah was thinking at that time, there's nobody but me, then you need to rest. We need to be able to rest, take nutritious food. And Elijah did that. He did that twice. He rested, God provided him food, and he went on his way. And then he's in the side of the mountain and he's wanting to hear from God. And over he keeps saying, God, I'm the only one left. There's nobody left. And then the wind came and he didn't hear anything from God in the wind. And then an earthquake came and he didn't hear anything from God in the earthquake. And then the fire came and he kept wanting to hear something from God. And then all of a sudden, there was a still small voice. And the still small voice said, you are not alone. I have reserved 7,000 who have not bowed their knees to Baal. Wow. Do we ever feel alone? We know that feeling, don't we? But God says you are not alone. And then do you know what he did? He gave Elijah a job to do. He told Elijah who to go and anoint to be the next king. He told Elijah who was going to be the next prophet, Elisha after him. And Elijah had work to do. Sometimes, ladies, now, after his glorious shoes and his running shoes, he's got to put on his work shoes. And ladies, sometimes we have to put on our work shoes too. Now think about Jesus Christ. As followers of Jesus, our joy does not depend on the shoes that we're wearing at the moment. His certainly didn't. Remember what he endured for what? For the joy that was set before him. Wait a minute. How could he wear the shoes of a young boy lost in the temple? How could he wear the shoes of someone who was despised and rejected of men? How could he wear the shoes of someone who was nailed to a cross? How did he wear those shoes? For the joy that was set before him. And do you know, during that time, secular history tells us that when people were being nailed to the cross, probably nailed here, nailed to the cross, that the robbers and the thieves and the criminals, as they were being nailed to the cross, they were screaming obscenities. They were cursing the soldiers. They were cursing the day they were born. They were cursing everything around them. And secular history says that there were times that the soldiers just bent down and cut out their tongues because they didn't want to hear it anymore. Do you know what Christ did while he was on that cross? Nailed to the cross. He didn't say anything. He did not say a word, and those shoes hurt. But you know what he did say? At the very end, when he knew that his Father had to forsake him. Ladies, Jesus had to go through his Father forsaking him. We never have to go through that. But if Jesus hadn't died on the cross, if his Father had not forsaken him, we don't get to go to heaven. And Jesus knew that. So he's on the cross, nailed to the cross, and he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. He forgave us for those horrible, terrible shoes that he wore for us. You know, recently I read a book, and it's called When God Doesn't Fix It. This was about a young lady. She married her sweetheart from high school. He was an athlete. She was a sweet, beautiful young woman. They were both Christians. They both worked for the Lord. And during the first year of their marriage, she said he started having some headaches and some trouble remembering things. So they went to the hospital. And for the next 2 years, their first year of marriage and their second year of marriage, they were in and out of the hospital. By the end of this process, she said she kept praying to God to fix it. Fix it. How many times have we gotten on our knees and said, Father, you can fix this? And she said after the 2-year period, she realized that he was never going to be fixed. She said that he was always going to have notes attached all around the house, everywhere that he was, to tell him what to do next, because he didn't have much memory at all. And she pleaded, why didn't God fix it? And after 3 years, she came to this conclusion. Maybe God didn't fix it because in some way he was fixing us to be used for him in even greater capacity. She said, now people understand my story. She said, we're being used now more than we could have ever been if God had just said, okay, I'll fix it. She said, we know now that we are a message for Jesus Christ. So sometimes when God doesn't fix it, maybe he's fixing us to be used for even greater glory. God uses the shoes we're in at every single moment of our lives to glorify him if and only if we keep walking on that highway of holiness that the Old Testament tells us about. Walking on that highway of holiness toward him. And if we do that, then the shoes we're wearing, whatever they may be, will glorify God. Now let me show you something in Daniel chapter 3. This always sticks with me because I think about Christ in the garden, and I'll tell you in a moment how I compare these two situations. Daniel chapter 3, verse 14. Remember now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been working what? In the government? Oh yes, there were God-fearing people, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who worked in the government. As a matter of fact, Obadiah, who worked for Ahab, was a follower of God. So yes, there are always people in odd places who are standing up for Jesus Christ and for God. So in Daniel chapter 3, start with verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them. Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Boy, Nebuchadnezzar thought he was somebody, didn't he? Who is the God who would deliver you from my hands? But listen to what Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego say. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Do you realize what they're saying to the king? We don't have to answer to you. But we're going to tell you this in verse 17. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. And look at these next three words in verse 18. Write them on your heart. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. But if not. Do you remember in Mark chapter 14, verse 36, Christ is in the garden and he is praying to his Father. Now listen, Jesus Christ had despondent times as well. He's in the garden. He's praying to his Father. He knows what's about to happen to him. He's asked his disciples to stay and at least stay awake while he's praying, and he goes to them and they can't even do that. And in Mark 14:36, when Jesus is praying and sweating as if drops of blood, and he's saying, Father, let this cup pass from me. Do you know what it must have taken for God not to take that cup away on that day? I know most of you have children, nieces, nephews, people whom you love. But being a mother, I can tell you that watching your child suffer is something you would take away so fast. Many years ago, our son Cliff called us, and it was late at night. He was married, had 2 children, and he said, Mother, my head is bursting. I need for you and Dad to come get me and take me to the hospital. I don't know what's happening, but it is horrible. Come and get me. So we got in the car, we went to get him, we took him to Vanderbilt, all the way up to Vanderbilt. He is moaning and groaning and holding his head, and honestly, I prayed in that car that he would not die before we got to Vanderbilt Hospital. We got to Vanderbilt Hospital, got him through the emergency, got him in a room, and they all checked him and took blood, and then they came and said, well, we're going to have to do a spinal tap. Now, Cliff is a big old guy, married, got 2 little babies at home, and he's a big old guy, and they said, we're going to have to do a spinal tap. And we're going to do it right here in the room. So we both look at each other, okay. The male nurse comes in, and he comes in with a needle this long. And he says, now we got to put this needle in your back and get to your spine and draw off some fluid. Cliff looks at me, sweat pouring off at him. My knees are just shaking, and the nurse sticks the needle in his back, pulls it out and says, oh, I missed. Oh, no. By this time, I am nauseated. Cliff can hardly sit up there for them to do it. And he said, Mother, would you get me a wet rag? So, of course, I went to the sink and I got him a wet rag as quickly as I could and took it to him and put it on his face and his forehead. And the nurse said, okay, we have to do it again. So he takes the needle. I'm about to faint, watching my son go through this and knowing his head's in pain and his back's in pain. And he puts that needle in there and takes it out and says, oh, I missed again. I didn't know anymore if I could take any more as the parent, much less what he was going through. And the nurse finally said, we're going to take him to x-ray and we will put this needle in through the x-ray. But you know, when I see Jesus Christ in that garden and he is saying, Father, take this cup away from me, I'm looking down as a mother and saying, okay, I will. Because we want to, don't we? But look at the next word in that passage. The next word is the same thing that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said to Nebuchadnezzar. They said, but if not. And Jesus said, nevertheless. Father, take this cup from me, nevertheless. But if not my will, but your will be done. You know, Jesus gave a lot that day. But you know what? God gave a lot that day. And every one of us are in a different situation, in a different pair of shoes in our life at this time in our life. And some are hard and some are easy and some are looking on and some are going through the pain. You know, several years ago, it's been 10 years ago now, we got a call on Thanksgiving morning. And one of our members, who was an avid hunter, about 45 years old, had 2 young boys, and he had gone hunting that Thanksgiving morning. His wife was waiting about 12 for him to come home, and they were all going to have dinner together. And she called us, and she said, Troy hasn't come back from hunting. They've gone to look for him. We're just hoping everything's okay. When his family got there, who had gone to look for him, Troy was on the ground, had fallen out of the tree, and had broken his neck. He had broken his neck severely. They went through months of physical therapy. They went through surgery after surgery. And 10 years ago was the last time that Troy ever stood up, walked, helped his boys with a baseball game, went in the yard and threw the football. And to this day, Troy can only move 3 fingers. And that's how he gets around with his wheelchair now. He can use his fingers to make the wheelchair go backward and forward. He can't turn his head. On a Sunday morning, when we're all sitting in our congregation, and Troy comes in, and we know what Troy and Angie have had to do for Troy to get there that morning. And Troy is going to do everything in his power to get there. Because you know what? Troy, in that wheelchair, is closer to God than he's ever been in his entire life. And do you know how I know that? I know that because of how Troy still prays. He prays. Occasionally they ask him to pray, and he has to get his breath. And he prays slowly and deliberately as someone who knows the Father. You see, whatever shoes you're wearing, they can take you further away from God or closer to Him. And Troy decided that I'm going to be closer to God. And he and Angie have taught lots of people. And I guarantee you, when he comes in on that Sunday morning, if there's anybody who's whined because their hair didn't look just right, or the kids lost a shoe, or, you know, your skirt was hanging out of the car on the way there, if you've whined about that and Troy comes in to worship, you can't even think about whining. Oh, ladies, we are so spoiled. We're so spoiled. It's not what happens to us in our lives. It's what happens in us, in every situation and in every pair of shoes. And every event is something that builds on another event. Once there was a farmer. This farmer bought a beautiful stallion. His friend said, "Oh, that's good." The stallion ran away. His friend said, "Well, that's bad." The stallion returned in a few days with a whole brood of beautiful mares. And the neighborhood said, "Boy, you got all those mares? That's good." Then one day his son was breaking one of those mares and broke his arm. And everybody said, "Well, that's bad." Well, within 2 weeks, war was called, and they were calling the young man to draft, but his son didn't get to go because he had a broken arm. And what did the neighbors say? "Oh, that's good." You see, every event in our life, bad or good, is making the video of our life. And whatever shoes we're wearing in a certain frame of that video, don't worry, they're going to change next, because our life is not a snapshot. Our life is a video. And every event that at the moment may seem tragic, in the long run may be something that can be used for the glory of God. So, ladies, understand that we may not like our shoes all the time. But in those shoes, you make sure that you are fitted for the kingdom of God. Do you really understand what was wrong with the rich young ruler in Mark chapter 10? You see, the rich young ruler, he ran to Jesus. He ran to Jesus because he had kept the commandments. And I know he ran to Jesus and he knelt at Jesus because he pretty much thought Jesus was going to pat him on the head and say, "My, you've done great." Because Jesus said, "Love thy neighbor, do not steal." And the young ruler had done all of those things. Jesus named 6 things, and the rich young ruler had done all those things. So I'm feeling like his head was getting pretty big about now. And then Jesus said, "One thing you lack. Listen, young man, you got to wear another pair of shoes. You got to change your shoes for a while." He looked at the rich young ruler. He said, "This one thing you lack. Go and sell all you have and give to the poor, and follow me." That didn't set too well, did it? Because that rich young ruler was comfortable in those shoes. He liked, it was easy to follow Christ and obey those shoes and obey all those commandments when you have the right shoes on. But you see, he wouldn't change his shoes to follow Christ. Now, I'm convinced that Jesus could have given him all of that back if he had followed Christ and Jesus had wanted to do it. But he thought, no, let me see if he's willing to change those comfortable shoes and loves me enough to follow me. And ladies, sometimes we're not in the most comfortable shoes. As a matter of fact, Mary Johnston Roy, who was a young mother, she had one son. She was a single mother, one son. His name was Loramian Bird. She loved Loramian. Her life just dwelled around her son, and she was proud of him. And one night, Loramian had gone to a party, and he had taken his friends with him. And at that particular party, there was another young man there named O'Shea Israel, and O'Shea was there with his friends. Well, about 3 hours into the night, Mary Johnston got a call. And the call said, "We believe we have your son in the morgue." She said, "Oh no, that can't be my son, not my Loramian. He's at a party with some friends." They said, "Well, we think it's him and you need to come." She said, "No, it's not him. I'm just going to send my brother." So she sent her brother to see if that was her son's body in the morgue. Within an hour, her brother called, and it was her son, Loramian. Well, as the police came, everything was told, the story was told, it went to trial. And the young man, O'Shea Israel, who was 16 years old at the time, was on trial for the murder of her son, Loramian. During the trial, it came out that by the time the situation was about to end, Loramian Bird was on his knees begging for his life, and O'Shea Israel had a pistol and shot him right in the forehead while Loramian Bird begged for his life. Mary Johnston sat through this trial, and she listened to all this testimony, and she wanted Loramian Bird put away for life. He was a violent animal, and she wanted him put away. She couldn't stand the thought of his name. She never wanted to see him again. She wanted that trial to be over and him to be out of the world. And it happened. Loramian Bird was convicted and went to prison. And I guess Mary was satisfied to a degree, but in her heart she kept longing for what happened there, what happened to my son. And then one night she was reading a poem, and the poem is called Two Mothers. And I'm going to read you this poem. It's about two mothers in completely different shoes. And listen to what happens. Long time ago, so I've been told, two angels once met on a street of gold. "By the stars in your crown," said one to the other, "I see that on earth you too were a mother. And by the tinted blue halo you wear, you too have known deep, deep despair." "Oh yes," she cried, "I once had a son, a sweet little lad, full of laughter and fun." "Oh, but tell of your child." "Oh, I knew I was blessed from the moment I first held him close to my breast, and my heart almost burst with joy on that day." "Oh, yes," said the other, "I felt the same way." The former continued, "The first steps he took, so eager and breathless, that sweet startled look which came over his face, he trusted me so." "Oh, yes," said the other mother, "how well do I know. But soon he had grown to a tall, handsome boy, so stalwart and kind, and it gave me such joy to have him just walk down the street by my side. "Ah, yes," said the other mother, "I felt that same pride. How often I shielded and spared him from pain when he for others was so cruelly slain. When they crucified him and they spat in his face, how gladly would I have hung there in his place." A moment of silence. "Oh, then you are she, the mother of Christ?" And she fell on her knee. But the Blessed One raised her up, drawing her near, and kissed from the cheek of the woman a tear. "Tell me the name of the Son you love so that I may share in your sorrow and woe." She lifted her eyes, looking straight at the other. He was Judas Iscariot. I am his mother. Two mothers who loved their sons with all of their hearts, wearing two different shoes. And on that night, after reading that poem, Mary Johnston decided that she would go to prison and meet O'Shea Israel. She just wanted to go and ask him, "Why did you kill my son?" I think this was 7 to 10 years later. She went to the prison. She asked to go in and see him. She had made the appointment. She walked into the room, and there sat the person who murdered her son in front of her across a table, and she sat on the other side. She said she was sick at first, that she said she was angry, and she said, "I just want to know, why did you murder my son?" O'Shea had no real answer. He said, "I was a 16-year-old, and it was pretty much of a turf war at that party that night. I am so sorry." And at that moment, Mary said she felt a little bit of forgiveness inside of her. She said over the week she started thinking about that other mother who lost her son, O'Shea Israel, to prison. And she felt for that mother also. So she kept visiting O'Shea, and after a period of several years, they became friends. She got up to leave that day, and he came around the table and he said, "Would you give me a hug?" And she said, "That's the hardest hug I've ever given anyone in my life." But they kept visiting. Over the years, they became friends. And when O'Shea Israel was released from prison, do you know where he went to live? Next door to Mary Johnston Roy. And do you know what they do now? They go around and talk to people and tell them that life changes in a second. But not only did your life change, somebody else's life changed too. And as Christians, we have to forgive one another, and we have to work through things with one another, and we have to help each other get through the healing. And it takes time. What about the Bible? You think many people had hardship in the Bible? What do you think about Job? Do you know why Job had tribulations? Have you read Job chapter 1, verse 1? That's all you need to know why Job had tribulation and why he had to walk in some very hard shoes. Because he was blameless, upright, feared God, and shunned evil. Those 4 reasons are why Job had to go through some of the hardest tragedies in life. And you know what his friends' problems were? His friends' problems were not that they didn't love him. Not that they didn't care about him. Job's friends came and said, "Job, you must have done something wrong." You know what those friends did not realize? They were judging Job's life by the shoes that he was wearing when he was in sackcloth and ashes. We can't judge others by the shoes that they're wearing at this moment in their life. Sometimes we're guilty of the same things. Somebody's in a bad spot and we say, "Oh, they must not be spiritual." One time we had left our home, Stan was preaching, we came back and the basement was flooded, and several people in our congregation said, "Well, you must not be living right." Wow, must not be living right because our basement flooded. You see, sometimes people judge you by the shoes that you have on at that moment. I know lots of you are having hard times now. Many of us are. God knows where you are. He knows what shoes you're wearing. He knows where you've been, and He knows where you're going to go. And in every one of those situations, you may have on a different pair of shoes. And lots of times we're each going to have on a pair of uncomfortable, ugly shoes in this life. But those shoes don't define us. What defines us is if we continue looking to the Master, running to his arms, trusting him when everything in life around us seems to be failing us. And he says, if you do that, no matter what shoes you have on at the time, when you leave this earth, I will give you a crown that can never be taken away. Listen to me, ladies. Wear the shoes you're in. They will change. But wear them looking forward to the crown of life. When our boys were growing up, we used to read a certain little book to them. The book was entitled, If Jesus Came to My House. It was a little red book. The cover had a little boy on the front, and it was just a precious little book. But the little book said, it started out by saying, if Jesus came to my house, I'd like him best to be about the size that I am and about the age of me. And then the book went on to tell how if Jesus was at his house, he would give Jesus the best toys. He would let Jesus sit in his place at the table. He would ask his mama to fix Jesus the best food. Everything he did for Jesus was going to be the best. And at the end of the book, the story says, Jesus personally might not be coming to your house today. But there are people coming to your house whom you can treat exactly like you would have treated Jesus. And it was a great lesson. And one day, he was between 3 and 4 years old, our grandson Nathan, and we were playing in the living room, and I had read that book to him, and we were playing with all of his cars and trucks on the floor. And I looked around and I saw a broken truck. But I said to Nathan, I said, look at all these beautiful trucks. Which truck would you give to Jesus? Do you know what Nathan did? He picked up the broken one. And he said, I would give Jesus the broken truck. I said, Nathan, I was so disappointed. I mean, the teaching apparently just went right over his head. I said, Nathan, why would you give him the broken truck? And do you know what he said? Because he can fix it. Oh, out of the mouth of children, because he can fix it. You know, we live on a farm. Most everything on our farm at some point has to be fixed. I mean, we have 3 four-wheelers, and when the four-wheelers go out with the grandkids, invariably there's one of them that doesn't work right. Or one of them where the children come in and say, oh, Pop, the four-wheeler's broken, it won't start. It has to be fixed. Invariably, a four-wheeler, the Toro, or the tractor needs fixing. And you know what I've learned about that? Most all of those things can be fixed. They can be. With plenty of time and sometimes plenty of money. It takes time and money to fix a lot of things. But what happens when the dog gets run over and has a broken leg? Not so easy to fix, is it? What about when one of the goats gets bitten by a coyote? Not so easy to fix, is it? What about when our neighbor calls and her favorite rooster, Mr. Man, she loved Mr. Man, she called and she said, oh, Sheila, Mr. Man got kicked by one of the construction workers here and I think his leg is broken. She said, I've called the vet. And the vet said he would, for me to bring this rooster to him, and he would fix the leg and might have to do surgery, could cost as much as $400. She said, Sheila, I can't spend $400 to get the leg fixed. I said, well, bring it over here. Stan can help with that. So instead, I told Stan about it. He said, well, let me go get Mr. Man. He drove to Spring Hill, picked up the rooster, and brought it home. And do you know what he did? He made a splint. Took him a lot of time, made that little splint, wrapped it very carefully on that rooster's leg. Every day he watched it just to make sure that the splint was on right. He did everything right, but you know what it took time to heal? It took time to heal. You see, healing takes time. Sometimes fixing can be done pretty quickly, but healing takes time. It takes time and sometimes adjustment in our own lives. You know, several years ago, there was an insert in the Sunday paper. And Marilyn, who was supposed to have the highest IQ in the world, answered questions in there. And one day the question was, Marilyn, does time heal all wounds? And she said, no, time does not heal all wounds. Some wounds get healed in time. Other wounds get infected. Wonder what's the difference? You see, the wounds that get infected are not allowed time to heal before they're messed with or start getting infected. You have to have time for that healing. And so many people I know have hurt feelings that they never can get rid of because that wound's not going to heal because they keep infecting it. They keep thinking about it. All of us have injustices in our lives. All of us have things that have happened to us. A sister in Christ not long ago was telling me about another sister who had hurt her feelings. And it had happened months ago. And this sister was still dwelling on it, thinking about it. And I guarantee you, the sister who had hurt her feelings didn't even know she had done it. Now, I told my sweet sister, I said, you either have to go and talk to that sister and heal this between you, or you have to let it go. So many times we have things in our lives that we just think about, and you know what that does? That hurts our productivity for the Lord, for His body, for our family, for everything. And I can tell you this from a very personal experience. About 10 years ago, within a 3-month span, 2 very hard spiritual circumstances happened in my life. One of the people who I was most close to in this world, and whom I knew would eventually become my sister in Christ, but she died, and she died outside of Christ. And I kept weighing over in my mind, did I do enough? Did I try to tell her enough? Did I try to teach her enough? What could I have done differently? And my soul was in anguish. And within that 3-month period, we also had another devastating circumstance in our family. A circumstance in one of our sons' lives that I could not fix. As a matter of fact, it was not going to get fixed. And at those times when those spiritual things happen that you know you have no control over, then it's a time you've got to decide to be healed. You've got to, or your life will be spent in reliving those things. What could you have done different? One morning when I was going through all of this, Stan and I were sitting on our deck having a cup of coffee. Now Stan was raising something that are called rolling pigeons. And if you don't know what rolling pigeons are, which I guarantee you 90% of the people in the world don't, these were beautifully colored pigeons, all deep colors and beautiful pastels, and we had them in a pigeon coop. And in the mornings, Stan would release them, and these beautiful pigeons would fly into the air as high as they could go, and then they would come down and roll down. They came down in a spin. And it was the most beautiful thing to see. And they would fly up, roll down in the spin, and right before they got to the ground, they would get out of the spin and fly high again and back to the coop. It was beautiful. But this particular morning, shortly after I had undergone 2 of the hardest experiences in my life, I watched those pigeons roll down and I thought, Sheila, you are in that roll. And on that particular day, one of the pigeons hit the ground. And that pigeon died. And you know what I thought? I thought sometimes people get in a roll and they can't get out of it. And when they can't get out of it, terrible things happen. Sheila, you have to get out of this downward spiral. And I believe that probably every one of us has felt that at some time in our life. So I go into my house and I decide that I'm going to institute in my life a new rule. And it's going to be the 10-minute rule. And for anything that is troubling me in my life that I can't fix, I'm only going to dwell on it for 10 minutes. I will go in my room, I will get face down, pray to my God, I'll get on my knees, I'll do whatever it takes, I'll cry, I'll pity myself for 10 minutes. And I will set the timer, and when that 10 minutes is up, I will get up and get about my Father's business. I'll write a card to someone. I'll call someone to visit in a nursing home. I'll call someone who I know needs a pick-me-up. Whatever it takes. After that 10 minutes, I am through thinking about that. Now remember, this has been 10 years ago. I've often shared this with lots of people, and I shared it with one young lady who had had a peeping Tom at her house and just had some terrible experiences. And she said, Sheila, I can't get them out of my mind. And I said, okay, try the 10-minute rule. And she tried it. I saw her about 1.5 years later. I said, babe, how's that working for you? She said, I'm down to 2 minutes. You see, it takes practice. Sometimes healing takes time, and sometimes healing takes practice. You know, those 2 things in my life never got fixed because they weren't fixable, not by me. And so I turned him over to the Lord. Some things are not going to get fixed. But how does God's healing really work? Well, I can tell you from my experience. And now when any one of those things comes into my mind, 2 minutes, 3 minutes tops, that I'm even going to dwell on them. I'm not going to be like our cows who sit out in the pasture. They're the most content things you've ever seen. They're out in the pasture. They eat the grass, and they swallow it in one stomach, and then they spit it up, and then they ruminate on it and chew it up again, and then they swallow it again, and then they bring it up and they chew on it again. No, I learned not to keep bringing up the things that I can't change. So how does that work for a Christian? Well, it works pretty much like I feel when I'm getting ready to go on a trip. You know, last year when I was going to New Zealand, I had to have everything just right. I had packed my clothes days in advance in little plastic bags and big plastic bags, and I had the suitcases all ready. I mean, everything was ready. That morning I get up, I try to time everything just right. I know I've got to hurry now because, and then you get in the car and you wonder, do you have your passport? Do you have your any other ID? What do you have? Do you have money? What? You get in the car, you're worried sick, you get to Nashville to get to the airport, and there is a line of traffic for miles. And by now, I'm just getting worried. I'm sitting there and everything inside of me, my stomach's upset, everything's upset because I got to get to that plane, I got to get to the airport, and I got to get on that plane. So I get to the airport, I go through security, all the time thinking, okay, Sheila, you got to do this, you got to get this started. I go through security, I finally hold my ticket and walk to the plane, and I sit down on the plane, and I take a breath. I breathe. I'm not even stressed anymore. You know why? Because it's not on me anymore. I mean, I may be hundreds of thousands of feet up above the ground, but you know what? I'm relaxed. Do you know why? Because I'm counting on that pilot. That pilot knows what he's doing. That pilot is the only one who can get us through this. And I can't do one thing about it. So I give it to the pilot, and I'm relaxed, and I enjoy my 14-hour flight, and then my 8-hour flight, and then my 1-hour flight, because you know what? It's not on me. If we could understand that we can be healed when we give the things that we can't fix to God and let Him be the pilot and get about serving our Father. You know, several years ago, when we were at Polishing the Pulpit, there was an eclipse. And I know you understand that an eclipse is when the earth gets between the sun and the moon. The moon can't reflect the light from the sun, and there's pretty much a dark grayness over the earth. Because that earth is between the sun and the moon can't reflect the light. We know sometimes in our darkest moments, we're in one of those eclipses. We've let the earth and everything around us and the trials and the tribulations of life, we've let them come between us and God. And it darkens our soul and it darkens our spirit. And we're in a dark place. And we can't be the light that we're supposed to be if we're in a spiritual eclipse. You know, Cain was in that kind of an eclipse. In Genesis chapter 4, God came to Cain and said, Cain, why has your countenance fallen? And Cain said he talked to God. He said, God looked at Cain and said straight to him, Cain, sin lies at the door. If you stay like this, you'll be overtaken. But if you do well, can you imagine God catching you at a moment when you're in a spiritual eclipse and saying, listen to me, sin is lying at the door. And ladies, sin is lying at the door, ready to pounce when we have sin, when we have a countenance. That is the worst time in the world for us to make a decision when our countenance has fallen. And you know Cain made the wrong decision. Don't make decisions during that time. Remember to go to the pilot. You know, sometimes we just pray that everything in our life will be okay. But remember this, God's in control, but only if we ask Him to be. Only if we sit in that seat knowing He's the pilot. He's not going to control the lives of people who don't love Him. He's not. A couple years ago, it's been almost 4 years ago now, we were in D.C., and 4 friends and I were on the subway. We were actually going to the inauguration. And every seat was taken on that subway, every seat. But right where I happened to walk in, there was a young man sitting in this seat. And he had dreadlocks, and his clothes were dirty, and he absolutely stunk. I can see why no one had taken the seat. But I thought, I'm going to sit down next to him. And so I sat down next to this young man, probably 15 to 17 years old, dirty. But on his hand, he had a white chalk. And that white chalk looked to be in a V. And I looked at him. He said, "Ma'am, do you have $5? I said, "Yes. And I'll give you that $5 if you'll listen to me for 5 minutes." And he sat there a little disgusted at that. I said, "What is that V on your hand in white paint or chalk? What does that mean?" He said, "It means violence." I said, "Well, why does that mean violence?" "Well, because I'm put here to do violence." I said, "Who told you that?" "No one was put here to do violence." And so I had 5 minutes to tell him that God loved him and that there were people who would love him and that he needed to go to the Word and find people who would love him. And when I got ready to leave and I stood up and I handed him the $5, and he looked over at me, and then he stood up and said, "Could you give me a hug?" Sure, I would give him a hug in a heartbeat, because someone else had told him that his life was meant for violence. Oh, ladies, everybody has a different story. Everybody has something that needs to be healed. Let me share something with you. This was written by a surgeon who had just done some surgery, and he realized that he had really messed up the young lady's face. And listen what he says. "I stand by the bed where a young woman lies, her face post-operative. Her mouth is twisted in palsy and looks clownish. A tiny twig of the facial nerve, the one to the muscles of her mouth, has been severed. She will look like this from now on. I followed with religious fervor the curve of her flesh. I promise you that. Nevertheless, to remove the tumor in her cheek, I have cut a little nerve." Her young husband is in the room. He stands on the opposite side of the bed, and together they seem to dwell in the evening light, isolated from me, looking only at each other. Who are they, I ask myself, that young man with this twisted, and this young woman with this twisted mouth that I have made? They gaze at each other and touch each other greedily. The young woman speaks. "Will my mouth always look like this?" she asks. "Yes, it will," I say. "It's because the nerve was cut." She nods and is silent, but the young man smiles. "I like it." He says, "I think it's kind of cute." And all at once, I know who he is, and I lower my gaze. And unmindful, I watch and see how he bends to kiss her crooked mouth. And am so close that I can see that he twists his own lips to accommodate hers, to show that the kiss still works. And I hold my breath and let the wonder in. Ladies, aren't there things in our life that get broken? Things in our life that need healing? I will never forget, Stan and I had been married a year. We miscarried our first child. Now remember, I didn't become a Christian until several months after we were married, so I was a new Christian. I was working in the bus ministry. I was doing everything I could. I wanted to love the Lord with my whole heart. I wanted to do everything that He wanted me to do. And I was working in the bus ministry. We were having a child, and about 3 months into the pregnancy, we lost our baby. And I remember as a new Christian, people coming to me and saying, God must have needed another little angel. Or they said something like, all things work together for good to those that love the Lord. Now remember, I am a 6-month-old baby Christian. This did not look to me like all things were working together for good. And you know, my heart was beginning to turn a little bit, that maybe God wasn't on my side. And then as I studied my Bible, and I read Ecclesiastes 9:11. As a matter of fact, when I first became a Christian, I'll add one more thing here. When I first became a Christian and people would say, good luck, do you know what I would say to them? Save your luck for the heathen. Just pray for me. Boy, I was a smart aleck about it, wasn't I? I'd say, I don't need your luck, just pray for me. And then we lost our baby. And then I read Ecclesiastes 9:11 and listened carefully to what it says. It will impact your life to know this. Ecclesiastes 9:11 says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift. Why is the race not to the swift sometimes? He might have broken his ankle. Bad luck. Wow. The battle is not to the strong. Why? Because the strong might have been outflanked by somebody who was smarter than him. Nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill. Just because you have skill doesn't mean God favors you. But listen to me. Time and chance happens to them all. God never said, when I became a Christian, that everything was going to be okay. He didn't. We live in this world, and time and chance and sometimes sheer luck happens to us all. The death of a child is not God's will. It's a random something or an illness or something that happened in this universe. And random things happen in the universe. It's if you believe and stay with the Lord that He can heal you through all of these things. Imagine how the Apostle Paul had to be healed. Do you understand what the Apostle Paul did? The Apostle Paul, when he was Saul, was a Pharisee with a pedigree. I mean, he was a Roman of Romans. He knew the law backwards and forwards. And when he was persecuting, murdering, maiming Christians, he was doing that because he knew the law. And because in that culture, Saul at that time, would have risen to great places of honor. Saul was a Pharisee of Pharisees. But you know, years later, a German scholar, Adolf Deismann, here's what he wrote. There is no stronger single person since Nero's days who has left such a permanent mark on the souls of men as Paul, the new man. What did he mean by that? He meant that the old man Paul in that culture, as we said, could have risen to great heights. But the new man Paul, this had to be the Paul that had persecuted Christians that he had to forget about. He had to be healed from. He had to go away for 3 years. Maybe he had to sit on that plane and let God be the pilot. Maybe he had to not dwell and ruminate on what he had done to the Christians. The new Paul, now the new Paul, who had made more impact on the souls than anyone since Nero's time, was the same Paul who wrote 7 of his letters from prison. Yeah. You know, that wonderful Roman Saul was the new Paul in prison, who had been beaten and shipwrecked and despised and snake-bitten. And most likely, the man who would have been so successful during that time was beheaded. And he was beheaded about the same time that Peter, another one of the apostles whom so many of us can identify with, Peter, the one who did things sometimes reactionary, the one who said, no, you're not going to wash my feet. And God said, if I don't wash your feet, you're not going to have any part with me. So Peter said, okay, then just give me a bath. That Peter. And that Peter secular history tells us, was crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy to be crucified like Jesus Christ. Yeah, that Peter and that Paul. And do you think that they did not need healing? But listen, in 1 Corinthians 24, Paul says, I now rejoice in my sufferings for you and fill up my flesh what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ, that for the sake of his body, which is the church, of which I became a minister according to the stewardship from God, which was given to me, for you to fulfill the word of God. And do you know who Paul is talking to here? Don't take this too lightly. Paul is talking to the Gentiles. You know, this Roman of Romans. He's talking to the Gentiles. Do you realize that the Jews did not like the Gentiles? As a matter of fact, they didn't hate them quite as much as they despised the Samaritans. Ladies, there have always been cultural dynamics between people of different races, between people of different sex, between SECTS, sex, between people of all different heights and in the hierarchy at a particular time. And when Paul says, I'm giving my life to you and you're Gentiles, what a lesson. And when Jesus talks about the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan, remember the priest walked by. The priest came and he saw the man who was beaten and robbed, and the priest didn't even go to him. The priest, who the Jews thought would be the most spiritual person, that priest just walked on by. Oh, and then came the Levite. Oh, yes, the Levite would be like the deacons in our congregations today. The Levite came by, looked at the man, walked on by. And then Jesus said, came a Samaritan. Now the lawyer, who was a Jew, asking this question, when Jesus said Samaritan, he may as well have said the member of a gang, because that's about how he thought about this Samaritan. But Jesus said, when the Samaritan came, he picked up the man, put him on his own donkey, and took him to the inn, and listen to me, paid for him to be taken care of. Wait a minute. He didn't put him on Jew aid or Jew care or find somebody to help pay for it. No. Listen, he paid for it with his own money. As Christians, we are supposed to be taking care of people. He didn't ask the government to do it. He didn't ask the innkeeper to do it. He said, I will leave the money for him to be taken care of. Now, at the end of this story, when the lawyer asked, when Jesus said, who was the neighbor to the man who was beaten and robbed? Do you know that in one account, the lawyer couldn't even say a Samaritan? He said, I guess the man who helped him. From day one, Jesus has taught that God looks on the hearts of men. He created all of us from one blood. He created every race. He created every single one of us from one blood. And you know, that's hard lots of times for people to understand. But do you remember that when Samuel was going to anoint David as king, and he goes into Jesse and he looks at all the sons of Jesse, and here comes Eliab. Wow, I think Eliab must have been tall, dark, and handsome, because Samuel said, surely, after looking at Eliab, this is God's anointed. But God said, oh no, Samuel, this is not him. And so he asked, are there any more sons? And here comes the shepherd boy, David. And he sure didn't look like much next to Eliab, did he? But God said, this is my chosen one. And he told Samuel, because God looks at the heart. And every one of us need to do exactly the same thing. Look through the scriptures at all the people who had tragedies in their lives. Things got broken in their lives. Look at David. David was his own worst enemy lots of times. But because he was contrite and had a broken spirit and said, Father, I'm letting you take my life, take the plane. I give it to you. And he was healed from that. And then what about Joseph? Oh, Joseph had so many hard things in his life. What about Moses? Moses in Acts thought, right now I'm supposed to lead these people out of Israel. They'll listen to me. I'm going to lead these people out of Israel. And God said, no, Sent him out in the wilderness for 40 years. And then when God called on Moses and he said, Moses, I want you to lead my people. And Moses says, oh, I can't. I don't know how to speak. I don't know how to talk. He made every kind of excuse. Do we make excuses sometimes because we're not exactly where we thought we should be when we thought we should be there? That's another whole lesson, ladies. But God will use us, and it won't always be in our time. And Job, look at the things that Job went through. So many things. We're broken sometimes. How fleeting some things in this life are going to be. You know, my grandchildren sit around sometimes and talk about who is the GOAT. Who is the GOAT of basketball? That's probably their favorite topic of conversation. And of course, we have some who say Lebron James is the GOAT of basketball. And you know, when they first started talking about this, I thought, what are they talking about? And then I realized they were saying which one of these two, LeBron James or Michael Jordan, were the GOAT, the greatest of all time of basketball. You know what I thought? I thought, sure, for this moment, one of those people might be the GOAT of basketball. But that will change. Someone better, someone greater, some other GOAT will come along. But you know what? Do you know who is the greatest of all time at healing our brokenness? Yeah, it's Jesus Christ. And you know why he's so great at it? Because he experienced everything on this earth that could possibly be a hardship. He experienced it for us. He knows the pain of rejection. His own family said, we think he's gone crazy. He was in teaching and they said, we got to go get him. We think he's gone crazy. Any of you have family that thinks maybe when you became a Christian, you got a little crazy? I sure did. But a lot of times in our families even, they look at us and say, what is wrong with them? Because we're clinging to the cross no matter what. And that happens in many of our lives. His family thought he was crazy. He was betrayed by one of his apostles that he loved. He was beaten, despised, spit on. But listen to me. On that first day of the week, after he had been put into the tomb, and when our Lord and Savior came out of that tomb, raised from the dead, he assured every single one of us that we can be healed of anything. Let the Lord take it and give it time. And then get on your knees and thank God that he sent to this earth the great physician.